Hi, I'm Clay Kilgore from the Washington County Historical Society, and we're going to be talking about the National Road. So I want to talk a little bit about the National Road. It's a very important road in American history. It was called the Main Street of America. It was the most heavily traveled road that we would ever see in the United States up until the 1850s. And it really has its origins earlier on, though. It would have been completed through Wheeling by 1818. The entire road was done by the 1830s. But we've got to go all the way back to 1754 to kind of see the origins of the National Road. And where it starts is with Washington's expedition. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but it was an expedition that was led by George Washington, Major George Washington, out to the Ohio country, so the forks of the Ohio, which is what is present-day Pittsburgh. And he was sent out by the English government, by Virginia really, to basically tell the French to remove themselves from the forks of the Ohio. The French had claimed that area as well, and the English wanted them out. So he went out in 1754, was not successful, and that was followed up in 1755 by Braddock's expedition. General Edward Braddock was sent over from England to lead an expedition out to the forks of the Ohio to remove the French. Now, why those two expeditions matter is because they were going from Cumberland, in Cumberland, Maryland, out to what is present-day Pittsburgh. There was no road that connected them. It was wilderness. So to get the troops out there, to get their men out there, they had to cut a road. So Washington cut a trail all the way from Cumberland out to near present-day Pittsburgh that he could lead his men out. The following year, when Braddock had to lead his army out there, he had to lead a sizable army with supplies. They had to widen the road. And so what they end up constructing is Braddock's Road. But it was primarily built for a one-time use to get an army out and get an army back. And so that was it. But when we look, when we go 40 years later, when we get up to the time of the Whiskey Rebellion, when the farmers are complaining that there's no road that connects the East and the West, that they can easily travel to get their goods to the East, the road that they're still traveling is Braddock's Road, a road that was built in 1755 for one use, still being used 40 years later with very few improvements made to it. And so that was, as I said, one of the farmers' major complaints about the rebellion is they wanted a road. Well, in the end, even though their rebellion was not successful, the government does start to see the need for a road that would connect the East and the West. They wanted to connect Cumberland, which was a large trade center, with Wheeling. Now, Wheeling at that time was Wheeling, Virginia, not Wheeling, West Virginia. West Virginia doesn't come into isn't formed until 1863. So it's Wheeling, Virginia. So they wanted to connect those two trade centers. Wheeling was really the trade center of the West. All trade that went down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi, went through Wheeling. Pittsburgh wasn't really thought of yet. It was Wheeling that was the important stop. So they decided they want to connect the East and the West. There was another reason other than trade. They also, when they had to send their federal militia out here to put down the Whiskey Rebellion, it took a long time to get the men out here because there wasn't a good road. Well, as the country kept expanding west, they felt they needed a road that they could easily move troops to the west in case there was another uprising. So one of the outcomes of the rebellion would be the National Road. Well, it takes some time for things to happen, even petitioning, trying to figure out where the road's going to go. There's surveys that are done. Albert Gallatin does a survey of the roads and what could be built. But it's actually not until 1806 that legislation is put into effect to actually build the National Road. The funding of it comes from the sale of land in the new Ohio territory. So there was a 2% fund put in place. So 2% of the funds raised from the sale of land would go towards the construction of this road. Construction would begin in 1811 with the idea, as I said, connecting Cumberland and Wheeling. They would reach Wheeling by 1818, but the road ends up not stopping there. They decide to extend it. They want to go eventually all the way to St. Louis. Now, it doesn't quite get there. By the 1830s, funding has run out, and they end up going to Vandelay, Illinois, and that's where it stops. But it's a lot larger, a lot longer than they expected it to be when they first started. Now, when they built this, they built it what was known as the McAdams technique. And the McAdams technique is a way of building almost somewhat of a domed road by putting in a layer of large stones and then slowly building that up with smaller stones. So the aggregate would get smaller. And then it was domed so that water did not sit on the top of it, but would rather run off. And so that was the technique that they built all the way from Cumberland to Vandelay, Illinois. So the road was able to be maintained fairly easily. It didn't go into disrepair as quickly as roads that were built almost as trenches. So 1818, it's in Cumberland. 1830s, it's in Vandelay. But now the government doesn't want to pay for the upkeep of this road. So instead, they turn over the portions of road that are in each state to the state. So here in Pennsylvania, we had to manage from Addison, where it crossed over from Maryland into Pennsylvania, to West Alexander, where it crossed over from Pennsylvania into Virginia. What the states did to raise the funds to maintain the road is they put in toll houses. So every 15 miles of the road, you would have come to a toll house. So there was one at Addison. There's another one that still exists called Seawright's Toll House outside of Bellsville, between there and Uniontown. There was one outside of West Alexander. There was one in Washington. There was one in Scenery Hill. So you kind of get the idea that every 15 miles you're going to stop at a toll booth. And as you're traveling the road, when you made the stop, you had to pay a toll. So the toll booth was built as really a house because the toll keeper had to be there all the time. Anytime anybody came through, he had to stop them and collect the toll. Now the toll is very interesting. There was a big board that was outside of each one of the toll houses that told you the toll that you would have to pay. So for each cow that you were bringing with you, you had to pay a certain amount. For each sheep, there was another amount. If you were on horseback, it was one amount. If you were walking, it was free though. If you had a wagon that you were pulling with a team of horses, it's kind of interesting there that depending on the width of the wheels, the toll would be a certain amount. So if your wheels were, I think, 14 inches or wider, there was no toll. Now that's a really wide wheel. Nobody had wheels quite that wide, but there was no toll. And if you look at that, the thinner your wheels get, the higher toll that you pay. And it makes sense because the toll you're paying is based on the damage that you were causing to the road. So cows cause more damage than sheep. So cows cost more than it did for a team of sheep if you were pushing sheep down the road. Wagon wheels that were thinner cost more because they would dig into the road. They would create ruts. So it cost more to fix the road. So basically you were charged a toll based on the damage you were causing to the road itself. Now, what type of people traveled the national road? A lot of commerce went up and down the road. So you had drovers, and drovers were basically shepherds. A drover would push, they would push sheep, a herd of cows, goats, whatever it was. Drovers would lead them from one market to another. And so they had these things called drovers' inns, which was basically a lean-to with a pen that you could put your animals in at night and you could sleep there. For other travelers that were maybe they were moving from one spot to another. They were moving further west. Or they were going east, traveling to see family, or maybe they were going to go back, they had business in the east. They would travel by horseback. They could travel by stagecoach as well. And so there were stagecoaches like the Good Intent Stagecoach Company. And you could book passage in a stagecoach, kind of like you do, fare on a plane today or a bus. You would pay to be taken from one place to another. So maybe you're going from Uniontown to Washington, and you would pay for that trip. What was unique about that is you paid really based on how fast they could get you from one spot to another. Stagecoach companies charged on how quickly they could get you from one stop, from point A to point B. That was it. It was all about speed. And so they would maybe charge you more because they would tell you they could get you to Uniontown from Washington in 2.5 hours instead of 3 hours. And so you would want to pay a little bit more because you could get there quicker. And so what they would do is they would have stops along the way where they would have an extra team of horses. So a stagecoach would come into a town, and they might blow a horn to let the next stop know they were coming, because as soon as they came in, they wanted to unhook one team of horses, hook up the next team, and be back on their way because they were paying for speed. The travelers were paying for speed. Also along the way, you had taverns, which were basically like the hotels of the day. Taverns where you could stop and get dinner, you could eat, you could find a bed to sleep in at night, and then move on to the next stop. It is said that there would have been a tavern every mile along the National Road. That is how many people were traveling. You're talking about thousands and thousands of people a month going up and down the road. So there's a lot of need for these taverns for people to stay and for people to be able to eat. Some of those taverns still exist today. If you go to Scenery Hill, there is the Century Inn, originally called Hill's Tavern. Hill's Tavern started in 1794, and up until a few years ago when there was the fire at the Century Inn, it had been continually operating since 1794. But that was a major stop along the National Road. In Bellsville, there was the National Hotel, which was a hotel people could stay at. There was in Washington, there was one called the Globe Inn, and there were all kinds of them. At one point, there were 15 taverns along the National Road in Washington, just from just along Main Street and along Main Street. 15 taverns because there are so many travelers coming through. Hotels were built. The Auld Hotel on the corner of Main and Maiden, that was built just for travel along the National Road. But you have all kind of taverns. And they each had their own unique drink, their own unique food. There was a gentleman traveling, he was from New York City, and he was traveling along the road. And he wrote an article later on about how fine the cuisine was. He said that he had eaten no better food in his life than he got along the National Road, because people took pride in what they were serving for their food. Now, you could also get some lesser fare for a quarter, for 25 cents. That would get you a stew at night, a very cheap breakfast, and a place to sleep. That's kind of what the cost was to stay in these taverns. But you could also get a much nicer meal as well. But the National Road, as I said, becomes known as the Main Street of America because so much commerce in the country is taking place along that road between Cumberland, Wheeling, and eventually Vandelay, Illinois. And so it's a very important thoroughfare through the United States. And it's the first nationally funded road to be built. Now it loses, it kind of declines in the 1850s and 1860s. For two reasons. One, 1860s because of the Civil War, but by the 1850s, travel by rail is becoming much more common, and it's a lot quicker, it's a lot easier. You can transport more goods by rail than you can in a wagon along the road. And so the road begins to decline as rail travel picks up, and now commerce is basically going over rails and not so much by road. But it builds back up again. In the early 1900s, we have a new invention that's coming about, and that's motor vehicles, so cars. And now there's a new need for roads. Now these roads need to be rebuilt. And so in the early 1900s, the National Road is rebuilt. It's straightened somewhat. They straightened it a little bit. Instead of having switchbacks going up the steep hills that now the cars can go straight up them. So they straighten it a little bit. And what is formed is what we now know today as Route 40. So if you've ever traveled Route 40, you are basically traveling the National Road. Not exactly. There are portions of it that are cut off. If you've ever traveled Route 40, and you've seen these weird little sections of road that cut off, they cut off and they curve back on. And so there's just a little portion where there might be some houses along it. That's most likely the National Road, because the road used to weave a little bit, and when they straightened it, they cut those off. But it still exists in portions. There's a large portion of it between Claysville and West Alexander, where Route 40 went straight. As you came out of Claysville, it made a left on the National Road and weaves back to West Alexander. And that's the old National Road. So Route 40 is not exactly the National Road, but it's close. So you look at it and you look at this road, that people travel on a daily basis on Route 40, and you can trace the history of that all the way back to 1754, when George Washington was sent out here on his expedition. And you can trace that to Braddock's expedition, to the Whiskey Rebellion, to the construction of the National Road, and then all the way up to when Route 40 was built. So when you travel the National Road, you are traveling history. You are seeing these historic sites every day and can follow it all the way back to 1754.